to be frank, I just don't think he could turn it down.
I think it clearly points to the fact that we're overtaxed. We're the highest taxed state in the country.
Brazilians are brave and courageous, and Brazilians would never accept this current affairs. So I had hope.
Welcome to the Aussie Wire News. Every now and then, a politician accidentally says what they actually mean. They try not to, of course, but occasionally some truth slips out, and if the cameras are rolling, the cat is out of the bag. A Greens senator in Ireland did exactly that a few months ago, but her comments have gone viral in the last week or so because of the Irish government's attempts to stifle free speech in that country and label things like Irish Lives Matter as hate speech. Here's what she said.
When you think about it, all law, all legislation is about the restriction of freedom. That's exactly what we're doing here, is we are restricting freedom, but we're doing it for the common good. You will see throughout our constitution, yes, you have rights, but they are restricted for the common good. Everything needs to be balanced. And if your views on other people's identities go to make their lives unsafe, insecure, and cause them such deep discomfort that they cannot live in peace, then I believe that it is our job as legislators to restrict those freedoms for the common good.
This is a common and convenient misconception that is pushed and popularised around the world. The idea that our rights need to be restricted in order for us to live peaceably with each other. No. Our rights and freedoms need to be equal in order for us to live peaceably with each other. And that's all. The point at which my rights infringe on the equal rights of others is the only point where my rights can legitimately be limited. It's not about the government legislating the limits of our rights and freedoms. That way lies disaster. It's about ensuring that our rights are upheld equally between us all. That is how we can live peacefully with each other. Because if it's peace you're looking for, everyone getting along with each other, then law is completely the wrong tool to use. Because law is nothing more than the authorisation of violence. Think it through. What changes when a law is written? Let's take something like marijuana, for example. You don't need a law against smoking weed in order to educate people about the dangers of abusing it, or to provide programs for young people so they find other ways to enjoy themselves and other forms of recreation, or to call out and even socially ostracise people who deal in drugs if that's something that you feel you need to do. You don't need a law to authorise any of these non-violent responses to literally any problem that you perceive. You can already do all of those things. What does a law do? It authorises the use of force, the use of violence, to achieve your apparently peaceful goals. Now, sometimes that is justified. For example, in dealing with thieves or murderers or reckless people who hurt and endanger others, violence might be an appropriate tool in dealing with people who really are violently violating the rights of others. But most of the time, violence or even the threat of violence is a completely inappropriate tool for solving our problems and certainly isn't a mechanism for bringing harmony and peace to a community. Now, you might be thinking that's a bit much. We don't use violence to enforce all our laws. And if that's you, then I'm sorry to have to inform you that we most certainly do. All it takes is for someone to resist a law for long enough for the violence to appear. Now, of course, we saw that during COVID, where eventually disobeying the Chief Health Officer's orders would get you shot with rubber bullets. But in reality, this isn't a unique COVID thing. This has always been true. Why don't we see people getting shot with rubber bullets over jaywalking laws, for example? Well, because there's this big process to go through first. First they get a fine, then a court date, and then contempt of court, and then finally an arrest. And if they resist that arrest, then they become the victims of violence over a jaywalking offence. But of course, by then, the media don't call it a jaywalking offence. They tell you that they were in breach of bail or in contempt of court or up on some other thing that seems more serious. So we never quite join the dots and say, are we really using violence to deal with jaywalking? Well, yes, we are. All law is, and all that law can ever be, is an authorisation of violence. And if a law doesn't lead to violence, it's because the fear of future violence was enough to ensure compliance before that violence became necessary. It's like when the mafia uses standover men and someone pays their money before there's violence. It doesn't mean that there wasn't violence involved. It was the fear of the violence that led to the compliance. And when you understand that, then the absurdity of this Irish MP's statements and the lunacy of the idea that we should use laws, violence, to protect people's feelings becomes crystal clear. From now on, anytime someone says to you, we need a law to... It doesn't matter what they say next. You need to correct their sentence to say, we should use violence to... whatever it is, because that's the truth of what they're saying. We should use violence to protect people's feelings. Well, that hits a little differently to what Senator Pauline O'Reilly thought she was saying, but that's the honest truth of it. When she says all law is about restricting freedoms, she's right. Because what she's saying is all violence is about restricting freedoms, and that's the truth. Why does someone use violence? Well, for the same reason politicians use laws, to violate and restrict your rights and force you to make choices you would not have made of your own free will. Contrary to the claims made by this senator, this is not the pathway to peace and harmony. It's the road to hell. The people of Ireland are standing up against this draconian bill, and that's a good thing, but I hope that in the process they don't just understand this issue, but they also come to understand the principle. All laws are violations of rights and authorisations of violence. And the limits of your rights are not defined by what politicians decide they are, but defined by where your rights meet the equal rights of others, and that is the only limit that should apply. That's always been true, it always will be true, no matter what our political class may think, but from time to time, it's up to us to remind them of that truth. Let's hope that the people of Ireland do exactly that. Now, here's the news. Well, I don't know about you, but every time I hear that there's a new season of I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here coming, I say, who cares? And every time they announce the celebrities that are going to be on the show this time, I say, who? However, this time is a little bit different. Not only is I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here back in Australia, again, who really cares, but they do actually have a person in this season that I find very, very fascinating. I've chatted with him previously, not on the Aussie Wire yet, but hopefully that day will come, but I have interviewed him previously. He's Nigel Farage, and his inclusion in the show, and what's happened as a result of his inclusion, is actually rather interesting for those of us that are interested in soft power, cultural power, using entertainment to influence opinions. But someone who's been watching this far more closely than me, because despite Nigel being in the show, I still haven't watched actually a single episode, but someone who has and more is Ben Leo, and he joins me now. Ben, thank you so much for making time.
Hey man, thanks for having me.
Now, you're not just a fan and a watcher of the show, you've actually come to Australia, you've been supporting Nigel in some way. How does that work? Was that just a volunteer thing, you just decided you wanted to come over, or do you have a working relationship with him and he's inside the camp? How can you help him when you're outside?
Yeah, so I'm much like you, where typically I wouldn't watch this series. It's not my cup of tea. I don't really care about reality TV, but Nigel has a show on UK TV network, GB News, the fairly new TV station in the UK. Sure. I work for GB News. I'm a reporter slash sometimes presenter and previously a producer on that channel. So GB News came to me and they said, Ben, this is big for us. Our star man is going to Australia. He's going to be in the jungle. It's going to be the biggest reality TV show in the UK this year. Do you want to go to Australia to report on every coffin spit of Nigel's progress and update all the viewers back home? I said, yeah, of course I will. It's winter in the UK. It's dark and grey and wet, and it's sunny out here. So why not?
So you just become like like an ET reporter just for GB News this time. Now, it is fascinating. Now, GB News, of course, the Aussie Wire and GB News, we were the two networks that were in the atrium at the ARC launch that happened recently in London, and we thoroughly enjoyed the guys at GB News were great to us there, and we thoroughly enjoy your programming. But it is a fascinating thing that Nigel Farage was, invited in the first place by the producers. I mean, I kind of smell a rat. They're looking for a villain. They're looking for someone to target. And then it's interesting that given that, he accepted. What was the thinking there?
So Nigel says that he's been approached to do I'm a Celebrity for the past sort of 10 plus years.
Wow.
He said that apparently they call him every summer and say, Nigel, do you want to do it this year? And every time he says, no, 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 no. But I think the clincher this time, and he's made no secret of the fact, is that, well, partly they offered him a mega signing. It's a record series signing of £1.5 million. Typically, the fees celebrities get on that show is anything from sort of 50K to $250,000 at the top end, but £1.5 million. To be frank, I just don't think he could turn it down. The second thing, which is more interesting, is Nigel has a desire to get back involved in politics in the UK,
right?
Or at least he's been hinting heavily that he does. And his theory of thinking was that if he can touch base or connect, I hate that phrase, it's a PR phrase, but if he can connect with up to 10 million viewers of I'm a Celebrity, who are predominantly young people aged 18 to 35, who previously wouldn't have given him a chance in an electoral sense before, and maybe the only thing they know about him is the stuff that the mainstream media print about him, that he's a racist, or he's anti-migrant, or he's a xenophobe, or whatever. He thought this might be his chance to give them a genuine side of him that they wouldn't have seen before. So I think there's a bit of forward planning going on there, sort of thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead. So for when he does get back into politics, potentially when the Tories get wiped out by Labour next year, and they are going to get wiped out, it's going to be a bloodbath. There's potentially going to be a spot as the potential for the leader of the Conservative Party in the UK, or there's a gap for Reform UK, which is the kind of sort of libertarian wing of the Tories to fill the gap.
Look, I can understand that logic, but he must be well aware. I mean, we're talking about a man who's been hated by the media for a very, very long time. He must have known, and surely did in advance, he was not going to get a free pass by the producers. He was not going to get any sort of favours by the editors. And of course, the media, who then take whatever's in the show and then report on it, we're not going to do him any favours either. I've seen a string of articles saying, the show has capitulated to Nigel Farage's xenophobia, talking about this particular clash that happened the other day. And here we have a reporter saying that there was a clash between Nigel Farage and Nella Rose. And notice the language. Viewers all say the same thing as Nigel Farage and Nella Rose clash, as though they represent some sort of a monocultured groupthink. Do you really think that in such a hostile media culture that Nigel might actually benefit from being on the show?
I'm sure he was probably aware that he's at the mercy of the editors. And to be honest, we have seen that play out in real time. I think personally, I've been watching the show day in, day out. I've been speaking to people that work on the show, that are inside the camp, that have heard conversations that have been broadcast and not broadcast, by the way. We can move on to that. There's some conversations Nigel's had about, say, Donald Trump, which ITV, the network behind producing the show, deliberately haven't broadcast for whatever reason. I think he probably knew he was at the mercy of the editors, but he's probably just thought, he's had decades and decades of being vilified by the mainstream media and the press. So if he's going to get paid £1.5 million for it, and there is a slight chance that he could do some good with it and take advantage of the situation, then why not? The comments about Donald Trump. So he's had a couple of rows in there about immigration, about Brexit. There's a French, we call them Remainers, people who voted Remain. Sure. They didn't want to leave the EU. He's a French guy who works in the UK. He's on a TV show. He said, Nigel, what you did with Brexit was disgraceful. It was disgusting. And Nigel said, well, why? What's the problem? And Fred was like, give me 3 benefits for Brexit. And Nigel gave him like that. And it kind of, Nigel came out looking the better for it. That's happened a couple of times about migrants, Brexit, and also this latest row with this Nella Rose person about cultural appropriation, whatever the hell that is. But Nigel each time has come out of that looking so good, and arguably he's won the debate and actually proven that you can have these discussions and these debates about what normal people think are taboo subjects. I mean, it's not that controversial to want to protect your borders and filter who comes in, but he's shown that you can have these discussions on a very basic level with normal people, what you'd call normies, without being toxic or tribal or being shown up to be racist. And I think that's a big win for him.
Well, see, you and I know that, and we've known that for a long time, and Nigel knows that, but it's still amazing to me that he's put himself at the mercy of the editors who could very well still have tried to twist what he said. So it's actually quite remarkable that you're saying that despite the editing and the producing and their choices to withhold certain conversations, in your view, he's still coming across very well to the public.
Yeah, so this is just a theory, and some strange people will call me a conspiracy theorist for believing this. But from what I've been watching the show day in, day out, as I've said, my theory is that at the start of the series, ITV probably wanted to paint him in a bad light by showing these rows about Brexit, migrants, and whatever else. It didn't work. And what we saw is in the subsequent episodes was a total airbrushing of him at all. He wasn't featured.
Yeah,
One
wow.
episode, there was out of an hour, 15-minute episode, we had about 40 seconds of him on one occasion. Another episode, we didn't see him at all. So we went from a flurry of these arguments at the start about all these cultural issues where he came out looking good. And it seems that maybe the editors or the producers suddenly thought, oh, well, this isn't working because he's not a racist. He's not a nasty Nigel, as they call him. And suddenly they just pulled the plug on him completely and we didn't see him for ages.
I wouldn't call that a conspiracy theory at all. I've worked long enough in and around the television world that reality TV needs a villain. That's what makes reality TV work, whether it's Real Housewives or I'm a Celebrity or whatever the show is. They need a villain. They thought they found it in Nigel. And maybe you're right. Maybe he's actually so successfully been communicating that he's actually turned the tables on them. Now, we actually had a bit of an interesting situation come up here where the person that we just saw him having a chat with, or primarily with, obviously there was a group of them sitting around, Nella Rose was then absent for the following challenge. Apparently there was a minor medical incident. She is back in the camp now. A lot of people have gone crazy with this. There's a lot of conspiracy theories, and I don't want to get too far down to the ET news stuff. That's not what we do here on the Aussie Wire. But is there anything to be read into this? Nigel ended up being the one who was on this challenge. Some people are saying that was a ploy by the producers to try and put Nigel under more pressure. Do you give any credibility to that theory, or do you think there's a more benign answer here?
No, not really. I don't think there's much in that. So that situation where Nella had to leave the camp for medical reasons, we weren't told, and I haven't discovered what the medical reason was, but she was just excluded from the trial before the voting even took place. Right. So it's not as if she was voted to do the trial and then suddenly they swapped her for Nigel. Right. It just happened to be that she was excluded from the vote. Nigel went to the public vote and the public chose him to do the trial. If there is any sort of genuine quote unquote conspiracy theory, it's the one I just spoke of, where at the start he was suddenly getting loads of airtime and these rows about Brexit and stuff, and people calling him racist and inhumane, and then suddenly because he showed that he's not those things and he proved himself quite capably, they just don't show him at all. I mean, that's got more substance to it. But on the flip side of that, just for balance, the argument is that Nigel's just boring and it's an entertainment show, and actually he's just a boring guy, and as far as the producers are concerned, he's not delivering the goods as people would expect.
Well, he's not playing the part of the villain that they cast him in. So now we get to my last and the big question. Do you think Nigel's got the chops? Do you think he can go all the way through to the end and actually win I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here?
So the way the show works is you vote for people to stay in the camp. You don't vote for them to leave. So I think he will get very, very close to the end. He's got millions and millions of fans, despite what the mainstream media tell you and the leftists. They say he's irrelevant and he's a nobody. But if he was irrelevant, he wouldn't have won a national election with the Brexit Party a couple of years back. He wouldn't have delivered almost single-handedly our exit from the European Union over the course of 20 years, culminating in that 2016 vote. He's not irrelevant. He's elected to the British Parliament, but he has had arguably the most influence outside of Westminster than any person in the history of this country before. So he's not irrelevant. He's got a lot of fans. He's got millions and millions of fans. And if just a small slither of those fans called and voted for him to stay in the camp, he's going to have a very good chance of winning this show. And do you know what that will do? That will send all the people at The Guardian, all those lefty papers like The Mirror, all the mainstream media networks who don't want him in there at all. They think it's some sort of like platforming Hitler or Stalin or some bizarre theory. It will send them into a meltdown, and I can't wait for that. I'm absolutely here for it, and I'm buzzing for it.
Well, you and me both, because from my perspective, now that we're in the situation we're in and he's in the show, really I can't lose, because either he wins and we watch the meltdown as you've described, or if he does actually get kicked off at some point, please, can you just slip a message to him somehow through a cameraman or something? He's got to make a pun about Farage exit on his way off the show. Like, that would just make it all worthwhile. Look, thank you.
He did sorry to interrupt. He did a promo video which hasn't been played yet, so maybe I shouldn't tell you about it. But he did a promo video for when the voting starts. He says, for the first time in my life, I'm asking you to vote Remain. Remain for me in the jungle. It's quite funny. So he does definitely play on that.
It's beautiful. I love it. Well, Ben, thank you so much for your time. Safe travels back to the UK. Thank you for coming on the Aussie Wire. And look, I've not paid attention to I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here before, but you've changed my mind. I'm actually going to start watching the rest of this season, at least for as long as Nigel's in there. Cheers. If you're not yet an Aussie Wire insider, then now is a great time to change that, because in our Insiders members only section, we have dozens of videos from the ARC conference in London. We came back from there with amazing interviews with incredible people, including Dave Rubin, Dennis Prager, Dr. Oz, and so many more I can't even remember, and a 90-minute sit-down chat that I enjoyed with none other than the Honourable John Anderson, former Deputy Prime Minister of Australia. All of that content and so much more is available to our insiders right now. So find the link in the description of this video, become an insider today, and get instant access to all of our ARC content. Well, the news broke recently that a Carnival cruise line is moving its berth from Melbourne to another location in order to avoid extra fees and taxes that have been imposed by the Victorian government. Victoria, of course, is both the highest taxing and the highest in debt of all of the Australian states simultaneously, so this appears to be just another symptom of a government that is trying to figure out how to make ends meet. Joining me to talk about this and the wider tax and revenue problem in Victoria is Victorian MP David Limbrick, MLC. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Aussie Wire.
Thanks for having me.
Now, this story, on the one hand, caught me off guard. I hadn't quite thought that they would be raising revenue in these sorts of ways, but when you look into the numbers, it really was a very substantial hike in the cost that these cruise lines would have to bear if they wanted to berth in Melbourne and berth in Victoria. Are you surprised by the response from the operator to just say, you know what, we're out, we're not doing this?
Not really at all. They've given us a wide berth, quite literally. When you raise taxes, that has consequences in the form of altering human behavior. That's why they raise taxes on cigarettes, to try and disincentivize people from smoking. Or that's why they have taxes on alcohol, to disincentivize people from drinking alcohol. And in this case, they've disincentivized a cruise ship from docking in Melbourne. When you raise taxes, sometimes they hit a threshold point where it just becomes uneconomic, or alternate means to get that tax just don't work. Like in the case of the cruise ship, it's quite obvious. They've just done a calculation and said, look, it doesn't make economic sense for us to berth here. Yeah. In the case of other things like tobacco, for example, they've raised taxes so high that the black market has stepped in, and then they don't get taxation from that. And I think this is like a real life application of the Laffer curve. And for your viewers that aren't familiar with it, it means if you've got a 0% tax rate, you get no tax. If you've got a 100% tax rate, you get no tax, because no one's going to do anything if they don't earn anything from it. And somewhere in between is your maximal tax revenue. And what they've done in the case of the cruise ships, they've raised the tax to the point where raising the tax doesn't actually increase tax revenue. It's going to lower it, because no longer does this economic participant want to play ball anymore.
So what does this say about the situation of the finances in Victoria and the options that the Victorian government is having to look at if they're going to these lengths just to raise revenue?
I think it clearly points to the fact that we're overtaxed. We're one of the highest taxed, we're the highest tax state in the country. And there's a limit to what governments can do to raise taxes, because they will cause economic effects. So if they raise taxes too high on payroll tax, businesses won't start up here. There won't be jobs here. If they raise other taxes, people might move into state. If they raise birthing taxes, then we'll get less tourism. So there's limits, and clearly we should be looking at what we can do to cut taxes, because that will increase economic activity. Clearly, and this is something that people often overlook, raising taxes doesn't necessarily increase revenue. And in this particular instance, we've got a very dramatic example of it. If they had have lowered taxes, potentially, because this is a transaction tax, they could have actually potentially raised taxes. And this was brought up during the stamp duty inquiry that I got up earlier in the year as well. It was suggested that lowering stamp duty by a couple of percent may not actually decrease revenue, because you would incentivize more transactions to happen, because revenue is not just a function of the tax rate, it's also a function of the number of transactions. This birthing tax is similar. It's not a tax on income, it's a tax on every time you want to dock. And so it's a similar sort of situation. And clearly in this case, they've gone too far. The operator says, no, don't want to do that, and they're out.
So taxation is one side of the equation, obviously, but spending is also another. And we're seeing a lot of news coming out of Victoria of massive infrastructure projects being either behind schedule or being delayed or suspended, big arguments with the federal government over funding and co-funding. We've also seen the cancellation of the Commonwealth Games, ostensibly for financial reasons. Of course, that's been devastating for the athletes involved and for a lot of the rural communities. As a libertarian and someone who believes in low taxation, I'm not against the cancelling of the Games, because I am against the use of taxpayer money. But that deal is done, that's been done, we just have to deal with the consequences of that. A very live question is whether the Victorian government should continue spending on things like the Formula One. Now, the Formula One happens to be the only sport that I actually follow, so this is a matter very dear to my heart, and I love the fact that we do have a Formula One Grand Prix in Australia, but I don't believe taxpayers' funds should be spent on it. Where do you sit on this? Is there enough of a benefit coming out of the Formula One, do you believe, to justify this kind of government spending, or should they be tightening the belt on things like the F1 as well?
Look, firstly, I'd say I've got nothing against F1. I think that, it's a great sport. If people are interested in watching it and want to participate, that's wonderful. But yes, I agree with you. This shouldn't be something that taxpayers should be investing in. It's not. Governments are not good at making investments. They waste so much money. You mentioned the Commonwealth Games. They've wasted. It's looking like at least $500-600 million. We'll wait and see till when the inquiry's over how much it actually is. They waste money all the time. If it was such a good investment, why isn't the private sector interested? Why can't they get more sponsors? And what sort of disincentives do we have in Victoria to hold the Formula One Grand Prix? Maybe there's like excessive taxes that would disincentivize. I'd be much more inclined for the government to look at how can they lower taxes and make it easier for the Grand Prix to be here, rather than subsidising it and picking and choosing winners with sports.
Very true, and certainly as the cost of living bites even harder, I can only think that these sorts of issues are going to start to come to the fore more and more as taxpayers begin to ask serious questions about why am I paying for that through my taxes, in addition to obviously paying for their own cost of living. Well, David Limbrick, thank you so much for your time. You're very generous with it here on the Aussie Wire. We're very grateful, and we'll touch base with you again.
Thanks for having me.
Well, turning our attention now to some international affairs that you probably have not heard of. Brazil is not a country that's been making headlines in Australia recently, at least not since the end of President Jair Bolsonaro's reign earlier this year. But that doesn't mean there aren't things that we ought to be paying attention to. And in fact, there's some very serious things going on there that reflect in some rather disturbing ways what we've seen in Washington, D.C. and what we saw on the streets of Victoria during the COVID lockdowns. Here to discuss it with me is Brazilian national, Brazilian constitutional expert, and former West Australian Law Reform Commissioner, a man who certainly knows what he's talking about, Professor Augusto Zimmermann. Thank you for joining us here on the Aussie Wire.
Thanks, Topher. It's a pleasure to talk with you.
Now, before we get to the actual story at hand here, just for those that don't know you, don't know your work, can you give us a quick background to let us know why it is that you have a concern with what's happening in Brazil right now?
Well, it's a very serious issue. You know that there are thousands, at least 1,000 political prisoners now in Brazil. They have been arrested without any need for individualization of the charge made criminally against them. Some of these penalties are up to 17 years of jail, and you have to take into account that drug dealers, murderers in Brazil barely stay in jail. So these are people who have been criminalized for protesting against a very controversial election based on an entirely electronic voting system.
There's some very strong parallels with what's happened on January 8th of this year in Brazil versus what happened on January 6th of 2021 in Washington, D.C. Before we go there, this hit the news. The Epoch Times, an absolutely fantastic publication. I recommend you subscribe to them if you haven't already. They've covered the death of one of the alleged protesters, but you make the point that this person is not actually, was not even involved in the protests at all. What's this person's story?
Yes, that's right. He is a businessman who was around the area, and had to be protected from the violent actions of the federal police, who was called by this controversial government to take measures against those who were protesting against this, as I say again, controversial election. He was not engaged directly in these actions or any action whatsoever, but he was trying to protect himself against the violence being committed by the government. So this is the person who was at the wrong place at the wrong time.
I can certainly relate a lot to that. There were civilians that got caught up in the Victoria police violence on the streets of Melbourne. They would take shelter, and I saw with my own eyes on at least one occasion, and have seen on video on many more occasions, people that were literally just going shopping, just out for exercise, getting arrested, getting tackled, being targeted by police. I can only imagine the situation for this gentleman. Sadly, has passed away, at least in part due to medical neglect there in prison.
Yes.
Now, a lot of people...
Can I say something?
Yeah.
About this? He was forced into mRNA vaccination, and he already had heart conditions.
Oh, wow.
Some of these people who were imprisoned were denied of even having a blanket and a pillow. And that includes the elderly and children being arbitrarily arrested. And they have been in jail for more than 11 months at this point.
Now, when Jair Bolsonaro became president of Brazil, around about, I think it was 6 years ago, so 4 years ago, something like that, I remember the headlines being absolutely breathless that he was going to be the next Hitler, that he was going to cause the death of civil liberty in Brazil, that he would be imprisoning his political opponents. So it's astonishing to see that not only did he not do all of that, but actually the person who is doing all of that is on the opposite end of the political spectrum. This is a president elected under the Workers' Party. This is actually the second time that he's been president, his third term. He had a two-term stint as president previously. What are some of the changes and some of the reforms that he's brought in from an economic point of view and a socialist point of view?
Well, he is a very dictatorial person, and try to introduce some measures that would completely abolish free speech, ban free speech on the country. The good thing about this is that he was so corrupt that the many corruption scandals made his left-wing strategy of implementing a socialist dictatorship not possible in his first term. But he, during the whole campaign, was promised revenge, and it was promising to destroy freedom of speech. So at least you can say that he has been quite honest in his promises to destroy the rule of law and democracy in Brazil. And that he is doing it very well, I must say.
Now, coming back to these political prisoners, it does have to be said, and we'll show you some footage here, that there were certainly some ugly scenes, windows being smashed, there were people walking through government buildings, etc. There are people who would claim that this represents an attempted armed overthrow of the government. They were apparently calling on the military to step in and stage a military coup. You're from Brazil, you understand the politics and the people there much better than I do. Can you explain your view on what does this really represent? I mean, we are watching windows being smashed here. Was this a genuine threat to the government of the day?
Well, look, the person who was responsible for the security of these buildings was actually offering drinks to those who were engaged in these violent actions. And he was actually allowing them to enter into the premises. And we know, according to Raul Jungmann, who is former president of the Communist Party of Brazil, that the left uses this sort of strategy of infiltrating into this movement to pretend to be conservatives engaged in such actions, when as a matter of fact, this is all done by the extreme left in Brazil, who is notorious for having this sort of strategy in order to destabilize any sort of protest or movement for freedom and the rule of law and democracy. Peaceful conservative Brazilians would never engage in such violent acts of destruction if we know very well that they oppose these things for such a long time. And so Ives Gandra also says, Professor Ives Gandra, that being a protest consisted of primarily women, children, and the elderly, and unarmed people, this could never ever be considered a coup d'etat, because in a coup d'etat you use weapons. And the military in Brazil, a contingent of about 500,000 people, not counting, of course, the federal police and the state police, and then would go to about 1 million people, are indeed heavily armed. So it's impossible to construe those actions as a coup. It's quite possible to say, and there is enough evidence for this, that this was all staged by the Brazilian government and the extreme left in Brazil to arrest innocent people who are now in jail without due process of law and any application of principles of natural justice.
It certainly sounds like the Victoria that we were heading for under Daniel Andrews. Thankfully, he's gone, but the current president of Brazil is still very much there. Do you have much hope that democracy will continue in Brazil? Will there be another election? Will it be free and fair, or are we watching another lurch back towards a dictatorship, something that Brazil and so many South American countries seem to lurch in and out of all the time?
Well, this is a plan orchestrated by the left to stay in power ad infinitum. They were not expecting the emergency of Bolsonaro, and now they took the necessary measures to make this never happen again. So the elections are entirely untransparent. They are totally based on an electronic voting system where we are actually not able to count the votes.
Yeah.
So my prediction is that there will be never ever fair elections under the current system unless something quite extraordinary takes place. And of course, this government is so radical that the masses might one day say, probably that enough is enough, and then you're going to see a bit more of meta-legal events taking place in the nation.
And that's never a pretty thing. I'm sorry to say that it seems as though Brazil might be giving us a comparison, a counterpoint to what we're anticipating in Argentina. And as much as that's certainly not good for Brazil, it certainly makes for fascinating viewing from the safe distance of the continent of Australia, and also gives us all the more reason to keep our paper-based voting system intact and not go electronic. Well,
absolutely.
Professor Augusto Zimmermann, thank you so much for joining us here on the Aussie Wire. We will stay across this story, and I hope that I'm wrong about the future of Brazil. Thank you for coming on.
No, look, we will resist. Brazilians are brave and courageous, and Brazilians would never accept these current affairs. So I had hope. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to explain and expose what's going on over there.
Thanks, Augusto.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching the Aussie Wire News. We release new episodes every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. You can go to our blog to find all of our past episodes. That's theaussiewire.com. While you're there, make sure you read all of the articles that are there, and also make sure that you sign up for our newsletter so that we can keep in touch with you no matter what happens on social media. Speaking of social media, we have the handle @theaussiewire across all the social media platforms. We'd love it if you'd follow us across all of them so that we can keep in touch with you. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Topher, and this is the Aussie Wire.